Hello and welcome to the Klassiki podcast. I'm your host, Sam Goff. Klassiki is your window into the world of Eastern European film. Subscribers gain access to our library of classic and contemporary titles, as well as filmmaker interviews, video introductions, program notes, and much more. You can sign up for a free trial today at klassiki.online. And if you enjoy the show, then please don't forget to subscribe in your podcast app and leave us a review and a 5-star rating. Thank you. Earlier in this season of the podcast, we explored the life of Emmerich Pressburger, the Hungarian refugee who helped to redefine British cinema. And this week on the show, we're taking a similar tack with another story of emigration and influence. Jonas Mekas left his native Lithuania in 1944, and a few years later moved to New York, where he would become renowned as the godfather of American avant-garde cinema. He co-founded Film Culture magazine, was the first film critic for The Village Voice, and in 1970 helped establish Anthology Film Archives, to this day one of the most important homes of experimental film in the world. His friendships and collaborations with the likes of Andy Warhol, Allen Ginsberg and Yoko Ono helped to consolidate the downtown art scene, and his many impressionistic diary films, compiled from footage of his life that he obsessively shot onto his handheld Bolex camera, have proved hugely influential on experimental film ever since. But Mekas never lost sight of his native Lithuania, returning to themes of dislocation and lost home throughout his career, most notably in his 1972 film Reminiscences of a Journey to Lithuania. And his work speaks to the cinema traditions of the Baltic region more broadly. His attachment to Lithuanian national culture also produced controversy at the end of his life, when questions were raised about his work under Nazi occupation in the 1940s. So, to untangle the question of Mekas, Lithuania, and the avant-garde, I spoke with Josh Polansky, a critic who specializes in cinema from the Baltic states. You can find Josh's writing on Baltic film and explore our collection of films from Lithuania and beyond by following the links in the show description. Josh, thanks for joining us on the Klassiki podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, Jonas Mekas, which is, I think, how we've agreed to pronounce his name for the purposes of this podcast, we're here to kind of excavate the Lithuanianness in his whole kind of career and his long project of filmmaking and artistry. So he's born in a village in northeastern Lithuania, near the border with Latvia, called Semeniškė in 1922. It's a rural location. It's a farming community. What do you think people need to know about the early life of Jonas in order to kind of set us up for the life story that we're telling here?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things is he's born, 3-4 years after the first time in about 500 years that Lithuania had gained independence of some sort from Tsarist Russia. And as part of that, I think his early years are sort of, and of course it's not, there's this back and forth with Poland and then eventually with Germany, but more so than a lot of other Lithuanian filmmakers and Baltic filmmakers more broadly at the time, his early life is marked by this period of national independence. And I think that is something that we'll be talking about kind of on and off throughout this recording on Mekas. And then, of course, the most important fact being that with the German invasion, Jonas and his brother Adolphus affiliated with sort of anti-Nazi. You almost want to call it a newspaper movement, but it's really, it's not really as official as this activism. I would say it's more of almost like renegade young men, and they were hiding their writings under this typewriter. And when the typewriter disappears, and I think that was 1944, their uncle, who was a Protestant minister, tells them, you guys need to flee. They get false paperwork to go to Vienna to study as students and end up never really making it to Vienna, as will see in Reminiscence. And he ends up spending 8 months in a labor camp in Germany.
Yeah, outside Hamburg. Look, just to fill in a bit more of this portrait, it's a family of, I think, six or seven siblings, very rural area. Um, he is, by his own recollection, quite a sickly child, a very bookish and artistic child. He kind of has access to one of his brothers to this library collection. He spends a lot of time reading. He described himself in those early years as being in a kind of shell, a poetic shell, cut off from the world around him. And like, I'm glad you mentioned that this is in this brief period, couple of decades of Lithuanian independence. There's a huge amount of Lithuanian language, literature, and commentary and thought and art kind of published and produced
Yes.
in this window. The window then being shut by first Soviet and then Nazi and then Soviet again occupation over the years of the war and the post-war years. I think we will maybe a bit later on, we'll come back to there's controversy and debate around Mekas's wartime activities. One thing is clear, that he was involved to some extent in this pamphleteering, this anti-occupation pamphleteering, and that this is the reason why he and his brother, well, one of his brothers, Adolphus, fled. So he ends up in this labor camp, as you say, and then he actually ends up studying at German university, the University of Mainz, after the war, before he and Adolphus get visas to come to America, which is where the cinema story really takes off. So what happens to Jonas and to Adolphus, who was also a filmmaker in his own right, once they get to America?
Yeah, well, even before then, actually, one thing that I found really interesting from his very famous 6 long interview with the Holocaust Museum was where he mentions the first photo he ever took. And that was of, I believe, a German tank. Maybe it was Soviet. I believe it was German, though. And he's very clear that this was the first image he took.
This is during the war.
Yes, yes, during the
He,
war.
he runs. He has this story, right? He runs out of his house to take a picture of this tank that's going down the
Yeah.
country road, and one of the commander or some officer jumps out of the tank and rips his film out of his camera and grinds it into the dirt under his boot.
And to me, I think it's important to note that this is where, he doesn't call himself a filmmaker, he calls himself a filmer,
Mm.
where Jonas Mekas, the filmer, begins. It begins in Lithuania. It begins during war, and it begins during this very turbulent point in national destiny. But to go back to your what you were saying, Jonas and his brother go to New York, where they become, especially Jonas, but both of them become very involved in the New York film scene, especially in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, which is, to my understanding, where a heavy percentage of the Lithuanian and Lithuanian American communities reside, or
Yeah,
at
I
least
think
did
they
at the
had
time.
their visas were for Chicago, I think, but then they landed in New York,
Yeah, they land in New
and
York.
they think, okay, this is better.
Yeah, he lands in New York, but that's where he spends most of his life, or the remainder of his life. And in New York, he becomes involved very heavily in the avant-garde film scene, and I guess you could also say creates the avant-garde film scene, along
Mm.
with a few other heavy New York figures. Maybe most importantly, some of those affiliations would be the Anthology Film Archives that he helped co-found. I believe that was in the 70s.
That was
Um,
1970, I think. It was already that's quite a long time later from that initial period, but yeah, that's certainly his most kind of
yeah.
lasting achievement.
And then as well as with the journal him and his brother started, Film Culture, which was more or less the first publication at the time that was really covering avant-garde film rather than mainstream and Hollywood film. And then that passion, or maybe passion's the wrong word, that interest, and you might call film criticism, although it was never really that critical, even if he was polemical in his writings. Eventually would go on and evolve into being the first film critic for The Village Voice, which obviously has a very important role in the history of film criticism.
Yeah, so it's at the end of the 40s that him and Adolphus arrive in America, right? And it's
Yeah.
those years in the 50s and into the 60s where he's moving, like you say, he founds film culture. He starts writing for the Village Voice. He starts being involved in these cooperatives that will eventually go on to found Anthology Film Archives in 1970, which is still, one of the main centers for avant-garde or experimental film in the world, let alone in America. And it's in this 50s, 60s that he starts kind of moving in these circles and collaborating with people like Andy Warhol. Some people say it was Mekas who introduced Warhol to filming, to film cameras. Stan Brakhage, the Beats, Allen Ginsberg, Yoko Ono, and John Lennon. So a kind of a very heady social and cultural brew that was fermenting at that point in New York, and he's really kind of he is the label that's always applied to him, like the godfather of American avant-garde film. Like you say, he was moving in these circles, but he was also helping to create these connections, create this culture. What is it about the films that Mecca starts to make himself during this period that proves so important and so influential?
I guess maybe a good way to answer that would be by highlighting some of his major works,
Sure.
some of his early major works. He starts off in a style that will kind of feel alien to people if they haven't seen any of Jonas's works. And that's his first few fiction films, or two films. The biggest one being The Brig, which was 1964, and it was an adaptation or recording, I guess you could say, of a play that Mekas famously saw and uh, part of uh, saw part of the play and walked out because he didn't want to see the end because he wanted to film it and he wanted to see it with his lens rather than to see the ending of the play that the playwrights had imagined. It won the Best Documentary Prize, despite the fact that it's not a documentary, at the Venice Film Festival of that year. And it takes place all in this kind of like 20 by 20 square foot prison on a Navy ship. And it is one of the most torturous watches of his career. The camera just it gets so close that it and immersed in this world of this boat prison. It's really painful to watch, despite the fact that it's also one of the shorter feature-length films of his career. So The Brig has this very different style, though, that you don't see in the rest of Mekas's work, which is often referred to as a diarist, or
A
diary
diary film.
filmmaking. And that's more or less what it sounds like. It is these short episodes or fragments that are put together of a place, a trip he's going on, overlaid with kind of poetic narration. And it always has, his magnificently unique cadence. His way of talking in these documentaries is unrepeatable. And his first major one of those would be Walden, or Diaries, Notes, and Sketches, I think it's sometimes called, and that is 1969. And that's his first real major piece, I guess, of diary cinema.
Yeah, the diary film is certainly what he's most associated with. He's certainly kind of associated with in the popular imagination. He's kind of bound up with the kind of creation of that as a style of filmmaking. And this we should have mentioned this at the time, but it's kind of several weeks only after he kind of arrives in Brooklyn, he buys himself a Bolex, this kind of handheld film camera. And then, if you only knew about him from his extensive diary films, he basically never put this Rolex down for the rest of his life for the next 50 years. I mean, he is constantly, it would seem, filming what goes on around him, New York City, his friends, his family, these various artistic kind of engagements and events. And then, like you say, kind of going back and chopping and cutting up and rearranging these fragments into these diary films. Like you mentioned, Walden. We've already mentioned his 1972 feature, Reminiscences of a Journey to Lithuania, where him and Adolphus travel back to Seminishke, to his home village. Lost, Lost, Lost from a few years later, 1976. And then the kind of really epic one is one he released in 2000, the year 2000. As I was moving ahead, occasionally I saw brief glimpses of Beauty, which is a kind of random chopping together of home footage from, I think, kind of 30, 40 years. And it's nearly 5 hours long. It's quite the experience.
He even filmed his wife giving childbirth.
At
Like
least once, twice.
yeah,
What?
I think yeah, at least
I
once.
rewatched it recently. I'm trying to remember how many live births. But when there's 5 hours of, you can lose
Yeah.
track of how many live births you've seen. Now this diary film and the kind of ethos, the filming artistic ethos behind it, proved very influential, particularly in this avant-garde experimental film scene. Why was that? It's a big question, but why was that such an important part of the establishment of this New York avant-garde film culture?
I don't know if you can get a more personal filmmaker than Jonas Mekas. He is often the sole person behind these mega films that he's making, these 5.5 hour things. He's editing them, he's the cinematographer, he's the director, and often that's all there is.
He's the voiceover.
Yeah. Um, they're not collaborative the way that Hollywood filmmaking is, or that most filmmaking anywhere in the world has been. You really get the sense that this is as close to authorship that filming has ever been. And I think part of what makes him compelling to me is what you said, how he never really put his Bolex down. He lived to be 96, and this was a man that picked up a camera in his 20s, and never really put it down since. I think there's probably a pretty good bet out there that nobody on this planet has filmed more than Jonas Mekas. And as a lover of movies, I find that compelling. That this man just he made the most.
I think the thing about the diary film format, if that's not too dry a word, that helped, that was so important and so kind of helpful in that early avant-garde film world, in those circles, was it's kind of premised on a rejection of narrative for a start, and it's a kind of rejection of the monumental, the complete, the kind of the plotted and the high budget and the high production value. It's that fragmentary scrappiness, the DIY aspect of it, the social aspect of it, that spoke to the spirit of those circles, and that helped to make Jonas such an influential figure within them. Now, this episode we're framed it as being about excavating the Lithuanian aspect of this. The godfather of American avant-garde cinema was Lithuanian, and I'm really interested in this question of whether we can locate Lithuania within the avant-garde as a result of that. So, how do you think we can or should go about approaching this question of the Lithuanianness of Mekas's work? He is working almost exclusively in America, in New York, in this American and international community. So, what are some ways into the Lithuanian aspect of Mekas's career?
Yeah. Well, I would start by saying that people are embodied. All of our experiences and all of our histories shape our worldviews and how we make art. And because of that, I think it's impossible to truly separate the Lithuanianness from what he's doing. More practically, I think that the first place is in the grand themes of his filmography. And to me, the at least the biggest one is this idea of searching for a home, feeling displaced. I think you see that most apparently in Lost, Lost, Lost. The first was an hour and a half of that is almost exclusively about this feeling of not belonging in his new country, and him and Adolphus both. And you also see it in films like Reminiscence, where he's going back to this place that he lost, back to his mother. I guess you see what it's like to revisit that home, and what that sort of, I guess, dissonance is, and that creates in Jonas Mekas. And one last thing on that is I think you also see it, frankly, in his film style. In the diarist film, you see it in the style, especially the sort of dissonance between sound and the images. One of my favorites examples of this is like a 12-minute short he did, I think, just titled Notes on a Circus. And there's different pop songs that play in the film during the time, but he separates them. So you'll have one part of one song and the images continue, and then he starts another song, and then he'll
Mm.
return to the first song. So you have this, you're hearing the whole thing, but it's being broken up. One of the things you'll notice in like reminiscences, or especially in Walden, is that he'll be at a party or something, and you'll be hearing audio from a party, but it's not the party that you're at.
It's never the party you're at.
And it creates this sort of fragmentation of memory.
Mm. It's this,
And I
it's
think
dislocation, isn't it? It's
it is,
which,
yeah.
which obviously he was literally a displaced person. Yeah, it's that dislocation, finding a way, like you say, through the kind of formal properties of sound and image to return to this great idea of dislocation, which defined his life.
Exactly.
I think that's also why. Well, this might be armchair psychoanalysis, but in I don't know, in these diary films, in a film like As I Was Moving Ahead, occasionally I saw brief glimpses of beauty. That is really largely made up just of what we would call home movies, just
Mm.
footage of his wife and children in New York. And there's that obsessiveness about that domestic focus and that domestic space, that and those domestic relationships, that I think really speaks to that insecurity that comes from dislocation, displacement, and so on. I mean, we could probably spend a whole episode just talking about reminiscences of a journey to Lithuania, because that is obviously, if you're interested in the Lithuanian aspect of Jonas Mekas, that's obviously such a rich text. I mean, just briefly, I mean, so it's in the beginning of the 1970s, him and Adolphus were able to travel to then the Soviet Republic of Lithuania and return to his home village, Seminishke. His mother was still alive. She was born, I think, in the 1880s. So, a connection to a very long since vanished type of lifestyle. And it's one of his most, to me anyway, it's one of his most kind of lyrical and poetic and sad films, because he's in this rural landscape, and you can really see him trying to kind of keep the Sovietness out of frame and make it look like this kind of subsistence farming peasant world where everyone still travels by horse and cart, and all his old friends from school are still there, and they're all singing the same songs, except they all happen to be 60 years old now. It's a really kind of compelling and strange and quite kind of dissonant film. What are your takeaways from that film? Because it is so important, this moment where he gets a chance to go back to that
Yeah.
birthplace.
I guess I'd start pushing a little bit of this idea of him trying to keep the Sovietness out. I don't think he does, or if he does try that, I don't think he does it successfully. I mean, part of it is it's just rural Lithuania, and that looks different than, the films that like Mosfilm and stuff that's going on in Moscow. You spend a lot of time on collective farms and stuff, and I think that that's just something that's inherently so Soviet, that maybe it's not the type of Soviet of the Soviet Union that we normally see on film. But
Sure.
so I guess I would
I
push that
guess
there a little.
I just mean that what he does go and visit this collective farm, but the way he shoots it is to say, oh, here's someone I went to school with 50 years ago. It's less the
Mhm.
kind of a Soviet documentary about that farm would have been much more about tractors,
Sure.
whereas for Mekas it's much more this lost human world that he
Yeah.
only has this kind of partial access to. I guess that's what I meant.
And that's fair. I guess maybe even a better place to kind of backtrack with this film is the purpose of the trip, which was the Brig, his fiction drama slash sometimes accused of being a documentary of the brig on the Navy ship. Um, was invited to the Moscow Film Festival
Mm.
as an example of anti-capitalist and anti-military filmmaking. And so you have his invitation to even get to the Soviet Union is one that is, I guess, premised on a political filmmaking. It's premised on political filmmaking. So I think that that's kind of an important background to the trip as well. And then with Reminiscence as a whole, to me, I think it's his greatest film. I think why I like it so much is it almost feels like the tightness of I'm hesitant to use the word narrative, but the tightness of the subject matter, I think brings out the best of him.
Well, it's like a
Um,
very compressed. It's like a kind of 4 days or so trip. It's an unusually kind of bounded
the middle
thing
portion,
for him.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's bookended, I guess, off of stuff in the beginning related to the immigrant experience in America and this feeling of being displaced, and then at the end, the backtracking of the route that he was supposed to take to Vienna. So, but yeah, that middle portion, especially, I guess, is very compact. But even outside of, I guess, the actual chronology, it has this almost a beginning and an end point that you don't always have with Mekas's films.
Mm.
And that sort of tightness, I'm even hesitant to say mainstreamness about it makes it
Well,
somehow,
comparatively speaking.
yeah, certainly comparatively speaking. But it somehow makes it more, I guess, fruitful, where he's going with the poetry that on screen.
So we've we've talked about a little bit about how just thematically and stylistically all his work is informed by this sense of displacement and this question of memory and home and the possibility or impossibility of returning home, which obviously all speaks to his identity as a Lithuanian immigrant to America. But I think there is also maybe some slightly more concrete cinematic links between Mekas and Lithuanian and more broadly Baltic filmmaking. Now, this is a little bit of projection on my part because we can't be sure really of any kind of direct influence back and forth here. But one thing that Baltic cinema in the 60s and early 70s was very famous for, and this is really one of the most pronounced and important movements or moments in Baltic film history, is this tradition that's usually referred to as poetic documentary. I'm sure the Baltics would argue amongst themselves. I would say emerged originally in Latvia, but very quickly spread also through Lithuania and also into Estonia somewhat, with figures like Uldis Brauns, Herz Frank, in Lithuania, Roberta Sverba, Henrika Shablevicius. And this was this movement or this tendency towards small scale documentary filmmaking that was often focused on ordinary, unremarkable people, rural landscapes, connection to nature, connection to local national traditions. Now, just from that elevator pitch version of it, I think hopefully people can see the connections that I'm trying to draw out with what Mekas was doing on the other side of the Atlantic. So what do you think about my thesis here? Like, what do you think about this idea that there's some kind of connection between what Mekas was doing in America and this documentary tradition that was also emerging contemporaneously in the Baltics, in Lithuania?
I think there has to be some connection. I'd start there, and there is some examples actually of a concreteness to the connection. I mean, Verba made a short documentary of Mekas on one of his trips to Lithuania.
Oh, I didn't
Um,
know that. Well, there you go.
it's a very short, and the only version I can find, the subtitles are in French, and my French isn't the greatest. But you do have some sort of concrete examples. Anyways, there is some sort of concrete connection. I guess an important part of the poetic tradition, an important part of that was the political component, and that
Mm,
was that they were intentionally being non-political in order to get these films made, but by also not being political and, getting rid of the talking head narrator. When you do that, you're also creating a new kind of alternative politic. And I think that there is a degree that that happens in Mechas as well, that he's kind of creating this very politically unpolitical film often. And you could argue that sometimes that's to his detriment. But I think it's important to not overexpress the connection either. Even if he's making these very poetic documentaries, there are lots of points of convergence or of dissonance
mm.
with the school. And I think one of the biggest is the use of narration. Often, most of these poetic documentaries, there's very little heavy narration in the way that Mekas has. Now, I think you could argue that he takes it one step further and almost evolves that style into this poetic narration rather than the normal, sort of journalistic documentary approach that you would see.
Well, yeah, I guess earlier you described Mekas as the most personal filmmaker ever, or something along those lines. And I think he couldn't resist talking over his own. You couldn't resist putting more Jonas in there. Whereas I think what's interesting about the Soviet Baltic poetic documentary makers is that they were very concerned with the communal and with these traditions and communities, and that's obviously a less personalized, a less kind of individualistic approach to this subject matter. So, like you see, there isn't a huge amount of personal directorial presence or imposition, if you like, in those films. I think it's interesting what you say about the question of political and apolitical, and how all these poetic documentaries on both sides of the Atlantic have this slightly oxymoronic quality, because the kind of the standard interpretation of the Baltic poetic tradition is that they kind of eschewed words and returned to the kind of simplicity and sincerity of the image, because for them it was a way of avoiding contaminating their beautiful images and their beautiful national traditions and cultures with ideology, with Soviet ideology, this kind of occupational force. And so by just kind of focusing on these simple and sincere images of ordinary people, they were being apolitical, but like you say, that itself was a political act. Obviously, with Mekas working in America, like the same thing, we can't describe it in the same terms, but it is interesting that both the displaced Lithuanian and the occupied Lithuanian are doing something here with the kind of political nature of the image. But that's maybe
Yeah.
getting a little academic.
I think another important part of his, I guess locating his Lithuanianness is looking at topically of where Lithuania shows up in his films because it's abundant. I mean, you have it most clearly in a film in reminiscence of A Journey to Lithuania, but you also have it in Lost, 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 which we already talked about, as well as in a film that he released in 2009 called Lithuania and the Collapse of the USSR, which is more or less him recording the 24-hour news cycle of his just from his living room about the collapse of the Soviet Union. And you're watching this, I guess, almost meta analysis of it. And it's released way later. So then you also have this idea of memory and where does he locate himself as part of that, and this distance of time that is always important in Mekas's films. I guess all that's to say is it's not just in these few big key titles that everybody knows of Mekas where it shows
Mm.
up. I mean, there's also a recording of his poetry that he did in Lithuanian. It's, I guess, an adaptation of his memoir. So you have all these different examples of Lithuania being a topic of his films,
Yeah, I
in
guess
addition to the style.
I'm glad you brought that up because I almost forgot to mention that my understanding is that in Lithuania he's more renowned as a poet. I mean, he was publishing poetry in his early 20s, like even before he left Lithuania. And he wrote, I think, fairly extensively poetry in Lithuanian, um, not all of which has been translated into English. And my understanding is that in Lithuanian, a lot of his reputation still kind of centers around the poetry, which is a kind of interesting sidebar, I guess.
Yeah, and that could be true. My understanding is more that that's how he thinks he's remembered in Lithuania.
Oh, okay.
Most often, I see Lithuanians refer to him first as a filmmaker. And maybe there was a truth to it that the older generations thought of him more as a poet.
Sure, yeah.
And as avant-garde and all that picked up, avant-garde cinema and Fluxus and all of that, that he became more of a multimodal artist. And it is true that his poetry is well known, but I don't necessarily know that it's more well known than his films. And you've seen that in the influence on modern day or contemporary experimental Lithuanian filmmakers. I'm thinking especially of Dementis Narkevičius, who is very multimodal, kind of began his career outside of film and photography, and cites Jonas Mekas as the reason for moving into the moving image realm. And especially has talked at lengths about the role of memory in Mekas's films, and that inspiring him to pick up a camera and start interviewing people. Mekas denies that his films are all about memory, but that's another discussion. And then the other major figure being Emilia Skarnolita, who is another kind of avant-garde Lithuanian filmmaker who does a lot with like marine biology and all this weird science stuff that's cool and at a surface level has nothing to do with mechas. But I think deeper down, you see that she's doing these travel films that are hyper personal and short form. So you also see his Lithuanianness show up in the people he has influenced. And I think that that's an important part of the discussion.
Well, we would be, I think, remiss not to touch on and just one particular controversial aspect of Mekas and this question of Lithuanianness and national identity. He's obviously someone deeply attached to his homeland and the culture of his homeland. That's clear from what he filmed and what he said and what he wrote. He was clearly a fierce opponent of occupation. Now, in the years leading up to his death in the kind of late 2010s, a debate kind of emerged around Mekas, around this question of whether his behavior during the Nazi occupation of Lithuania from 1941 constituted, whether it was kind of politically naive or verging on kind of collaborationist. He published in and was kind of involved in the production of two newspapers that were tied to kind of collaborationist fascist Lithuanian political groups. Mekas always claimed that he was also simultaneously doing this kind of underground anti-occupation pamphleteering, and I think it's established that he personally never published anything that we could call fascistic or anti-Semitic or so on. But there is nonetheless this question of national identity blurring into nationalism in that context of occupation that created this huge controversy around Mekas shortly before his death. And I think, if we're going to sit here and talk about Lithuania in inverted commas in Mekas's work, like we're not going to relitigate this question now, but it would be remiss of us not to at least acknowledge the ways in which, like this an attachment to national identity for him, especially in the context of wartime occupation, was verging on some pretty dangerous stuff. I don't know what you'd want people to come away
Yeah.
thinking about with that.
I would just add that there's really no claim that he himself contributed in any way to actual anti-Semitic writings in the paper, even if he was
Mm,
writing for these papers that were publishing anti-Semitic articles and whatnot, and that there's really no claim in any way that he helped, I guess, with like the material reality of collaboration. And I think that
mm,
both of those are kind of important things to acknowledge, as well as maybe to just very, very briefly oversimplify a general, I guess, the historical context of it being, as you mentioned earlier, the order of occupations in Lithuania at this time being Soviet, German, Soviet. And because of that, in that first period of Soviet occupation, sometimes the Nazis were seen as these sort of liberators, because they were breaking through an existing occupation that most Lithuanians at the time, I think, they weren't advocating necessarily for, or they weren't advocating for Nazi occupation, but that there was some sort of hope or naivete that maybe this would help a Lithuanian nationalistic movement towards national sovereignty, and that the Nazis would help deliver that by kicking out the Soviets. And then I think later you see the same thing, and that's why he eventually has to flee. Is that when the Soviets are, or when the Nazis are occupying, he's doing the same sort of, I guess, anti-occupation stuff that he had done earlier and had gotten in trouble with earlier, with the
I
pamphleteers.
I guess the important point there would be, and again, this is not the place to relitigate these historical debates, but one of the reasons why the kind of nationalistic movements were able to view the Nazis replacing the Soviets in that respect was because they shared an anti-Semitic, like a violent anti-Semitic
Mm,
prejudice with the Nazis, and then would go on to kind of collaborate in the Holocaust in Lithuania, and that's the
yeah,
it's important not to like. There's a long history of whitewashing around that
yeah,
with the Baltics, and it's important to state that. Like I say, we're not going to relitigate that now, but it's important to say that, and I think not just out of some kind of historical score settling, but just in conclusion and stepping back and thinking about this strange contradictory character of Mekas and this strangely contradictory Lithuanian American international work that he produced. There's something about his kind of performance of naivety in his films, his kind of rejection of the idea of being a filmmaker or an artist, describing himself as a simple filmer, refusing to kind of impose narratives, delighting in this simplistic domestic imagery, referring always back to this concept of home and a lost home. There's something about that which, when you consider it in this historical perspective, takes on this slightly more slippery character. Like we were saying, you can be political by being apolitical, and I think with Mekas, sometimes he obscured some of the more difficult and knotty aspects of his own life and his own personality with this appeal to a naivety or a kind of apolitical, kind of poetic sensibility. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
yeah. I guess I would just say he was a very personal filmmaker, and that sometimes because of how personal of a filmmaker he was, his life story makes it a more complicated story than a film that has many collaborators would. We've been using this apolitical political terminology in relation to the Baltic poetic tradition, but also don't want to oversimplify that sometimes he
Sure,
was
sure.
political.
Yeah.
I mean, he has the one short with was it the president from Finland, a fake president from Finland that's really his brother, and is giving this speech about how uh, he thinks the Americans should basically make the Vietnamese soldiers into like free slave labor. And it's this mockery of American politics.
Mm,
It's a parody. At times, he was very political. And I guess it's his bigger works that it's more fair to kind of charge with this poetic apoliticalness.
mm. When this controversy was raging shortly before his, I think in kind of the year before his death, about this question of his wartime activities, the great American film critic Jay Hoberman, who's a very politically engaged writer and who knew Mekas fairly well, wrote about the controversy, and there's a quote, there's a description of Mekas in what he wrote that I think is kind of really apposite here. He said, where is it? Jonas is a contradictory man. He's a sophisticated knife, a self-described dreamer, and a hard-headed tactician, an opponent of authority who operated from a succession of power bases, selfless yet self-absorbed, a farm boy adept at hobnobbing with the rich and privileged, and a man fervently attached to his roots, yet largely self-invented. Well, Josh Polansky, thanks so much for taking the time to walk us through the complicated life story and the complicated artistic story of Jonas Mekas and Lithuania and Baltic documentary and everything in between. Thanks so much, Josh, for your time.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks for having me, and thanks for all that you and Klassiki do for Eastern European cinema.